Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Broker Daily, where I dive deep with my team of experts to help you in a typical New York City transaction and find out what really happens beneath the cover. So today we're back with real estate attorney Ira Gold. Hey, Ira, how are you today?
Very good, Ed. Good to be back.
Great to see you. Today we'll dive into a topic that is complex. It can be complex, and I know you're an expert on it. It's called FIRPTA. It's a funny little name that means it's the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act of 1980. So,
Correct. Which is
correct.
why we call it FIRPTA.
That's right. Hey, here in New York, we like to abbreviate things.
Exactly.
South of Houston Street, Soho.
It's a mouthful, but yeah.
That's right. That's right. So we'll talk about FIRPTA today. I actually have a seller right now who is not a citizen of the United States. He's selling a property, and we're going to talk about this FIRPTA and what that means to that seller. So Ira, please, tell us a little bit about FIRPTA, who that applies to, and we'll take it from there.
FIRPTA is a very complex law, as you alluded to in your opening. At its most basic, it applies in New York City and New York State. It's a federal statute, so it applies all over the country. But for what we're doing, sellers, if they are not U.S. citizens or permanent residents, where they have a green card, in most circumstances, when they go to sell a property, the buyer is obligated to withhold a percentage of the purchase price, 15% in most instances, and remit that to the federal government so that the federal government is secure that any gains tax owed on the sale of this by this foreign national will be paid. So the purpose of the statute is that when somebody's not a citizen and there's no real connection and now they're selling their property, the government doesn't want to lose out on the taxes.
Right.
The key is there are exemptions to that, but in general, it's an important element, particularly for a buyer's attorney, to understand who they're buying the property from and what their status is.
We're at this closing. The closing's done. The buyer, do they hold on to some kind of proof or something, or is there an affidavit or anything like that they need?
Yeah, almost all attorneys should. Not all do, but they absolutely should ask the seller's attorney if they have a FIRPTA certificate or affidavit. That certificate will tell the buyer they're either a U.S. citizen or they're permanent resident, give their social security number, the property address, and advise the buyer that the buyer does not need to withhold the 15%. That piece of paper can then go in the buyer's attorney's file so that if at any point down the road, and this has happened to me as an attorney, the government comes back and says, hey, you didn't collect FIRPTA and there's a FIRPTA issue, you pull that FIRPTA certificate out of your file, you thank heavens you have it, and you show it to the government, and that should alleviate the buyer of any liability for having missed that payment, because the buyer is entitled to rely on a seller signing an affidavit saying, I'm a U.S. citizen, here's my social, you don't need to collect. So that's a very important element that a buyer's attorney needs to be cognizant of. If you're a seller's attorney, it should be one of the first things to ask your client, I know it's one of the first things I do, are you a U.S. citizen? Do you have a green card? Because it's also a representation in the contract of sale, either that you are or you're not. And if somebody does not have a citizenship or a green card, then you have to take steps to work with the buyer's attorney to get the paperwork necessary to withhold the money and file it. Because the seller may not be liable for the full 15%, even though that's being taken out. And there are ways to reduce that 15%, but that gets complicated, but that can be done as well. It relies on the IRS acting timely. You get what's known as a withholding certificate. But, I don't want to get into the weeds too much with that.
We can. At some point, we will go down that rabbit hole
Okay.
with you, Ira, and I look forward to that. So as a broker, before we get to Ira with a contract of sale, we always need to identify the identities of people as in this transaction. So with a buyer, it's, are you the purchaser? I mean, is it a trust? Maybe parents buying for children. That when we put it on the deal summary that we spoke about in session 1, I think it was, or session 2 with you, Ira, the broker puts together the deal summary that goes out to the attorneys that lay out the essential elements of the contract. And with the seller, we want the same thing. We want to make sure that, that who the actual seller is or the holder of the shares in a cooperative, and if they are are not a U.S. citizen, and that way we can get the deal summary correct, so that you don't have to kind of double check our work. That we've already done that. We know who we're dealing with. We're giving this to you, so that you as the seller or the buyer's attorney can go back with the other side. Is that right, Ira?
Yep, absolutely.
That is right. So it's a team effort of what goes on, before, during, and with FIRPTA after, right? So, when the closing's done, we want to make sure that all of the documents that were supposed to be filed were filed, and we've done this correctly, so that it is signed, sealed, and delivered, and closed, and done.
Absolutely,
right?
very important.
And that's what you're here for, and I've learned so much from you, Ira. So, Ira, thank you so much on the FIRPTA explanation.
My pleasure, Ed. Thank you.
Appreciate that so much. We'll see you next time on Broker Daily. Have a great day.
Thank you, you too.